Um, Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Oladiran Bello. I'm in the name of FRIDE, Fundación para las Relaciones Internacionales y el Diálogo Exterior, for which I work as Research and Development Corporation. I would like to welcome you all. Before I assume my proper role of moderating this event, I would like to welcome Belén Becerril to please welcome you all as the representative of the university where this event is being hosted today. Belén, please.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, on behalf of CEU San Pablo University, and more precisely on behalf of the Institute for European Studies of this university, welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you, first of all, to FRIDE for our nice collaboration in this and in many other projects. Please let me welcome you and tell you just in a few words what the Institute for European Studies is. This institute is a research center, Jan Vandemoortele Center of Excellence of this University CEU San Pablo, chaired by our President Marcelina Oreja Aguirre. It's a center that focuses on two main areas. First of all, research, and then also we have master degrees. In the field of research, we develop different projects, very often with European institutions, with the European Commission, and with the European Parliament. And more precisely, in the field of development cooperation, we have two projects with CODESPA, which is a Spanish NGO, and we deal more precisely with two subjects. First of all, good governance, and secondly, project evaluation. We have a course on project evaluation in the field of development cooperation, and we have various research projects in the field of good governance. And as I told you, we also focus on master degrees. We have 3 official master degrees, one of them about European studies, the other about international legal practice, and the third about international relations. In this field, we also cooperate with several researchers from FRIDE, like Oladiran, like Ryszard as well. So we have various links with this institution. Well, you're very welcome again. It's a pleasure for us to be here, and nothing else. Oladiran, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Belén. Let me also start by thanking the European Commission, who of course are the sponsors of this event, the United Nations Development Program, who put themselves in touch with us to initiate this. This event forms part of the second series of the Kapuscinsky Lectures. And colleagues from here in the university, I'm not talking about cappuccino. It's Kapuscinsky Lectures. They are held at prestigious venues like this one and right around the world. There would be one in Brussels next week, as I understand. Jan Vandemoortele, the UNDP representative from Bratislava, is here with us. I thank you for coming, Jan, and I would like you to say maybe 1 or 2 words. Before you do so, I must confess that the budget showdown in Washington is not the only one we've had lately. It took us about 6 months to actually arrive at an agreement on the budget for this event. Jan was a very tough negotiator. But seeing all these bright faces in the audience, I think it's been well worth the pen. If you want to come forward, please, Jan.
Thank you very much, Oladiran. Thank you for the university for hosting us here and FRIDE for organizing it. Indeed, it's already a second series of these lectures called the Kapuscinsky Lectures, organized. It's an initiative of the European Commission, funded by the European Commission and implemented jointly with UN Development Program, which I'm representing, and also partner think tanks and universities across the entire European Union. It started in 2009, and I'm very glad that this time we arrived in Madrid. The major objective of these lectures is to raise awareness on different development issues, sometimes development in general, but also development aid, effectiveness, Millennium Development Goals, like here today with Mr. Jan Vandemoortele, sometimes climate and development or human rights and development and so on. Raise awareness, but also had the opportunity to interact with the eminent speakers and experts in development, like here today, Jan Vandemoortele. The initiative holds the name of Ryszard Kapuscinsky, again not cappuccino, but Kapuscinsky, a Polish journalist and writer. Some of you might know some of his books. He passed away in 2007, but was famous for actually bringing closer to us in general, Europeans and or people in the north, let's say, in simplification, the pictures, the needs, the actual situations in developing countries, which was, I can say, I'm Polish, I'm from Poland, was very important and sometimes exotic, but that actually proved the importance of supporting development and development cooperation. So thank you very much, and have very interesting lecture and discussion afterwards, I wish you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. Before I proceed to introduce Dr. Jan Vandemoortele, I'm the guest lecturer for today. There are a few people in the audience that I would just like to acknowledge very quickly on the behalf of FRIDE, starting with Diego Hidalgo, who is our founder. Thank you very much for coming, Diego. Also to my far right is Sylvia Hidalgo, one of the members of our board of trustees. Thanks for coming, Sylvia. I'm sure you would have the opportunity to say one or two things after Dr. Vandemoortele. And of course, I plead the indulgence of many important people in the audience whom I'm not able to mention personally. I think speed is of the essence here. And the excellencies among our student colleagues, whom I'm sure would go on to really illustrious careers to become diplomats and worthy representative of Spain in the future. I would like to welcome you all. Now to the business end. In September 2010, world leaders gathered in New York to review progress on the Millennium Development Goals. I think that meeting marked exactly the 10-year point after they were first unveiled at the Millennium Summit in 2000. And it also represented 5 years up until the 2015 target date by which these goals were expected to be realized. In all humility, Jan is the expert here. But I would maybe like to say that one thing that came out very strongly from that summit was the realization that the goals were lagging behind in different parts of the world, including in Africa, suggesting that a significant scaling up of the existing effort was needed. Maybe some of the framework needed tweaking to go a bit faster. I think one of the changes that one needs to highlight is what we've seen in the world over the last 10 to 15 years. We're faced with a vastly transformed world, different from that in 2000 when these goals were first agreed. So we face a vastly transformed geopolitical landscape. The rich Western world where we are today is gradually being joined by a group of so-called emerging powers from the global south. But the emerging economies go beyond this group of so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And many of these new emerging actors are trying to exert their influence, not only with respect to the reform of the global governance architecture, but also in the area of development. As a matter of fact, many of them are espousing their own vision of how alternative approaches to development should be pursued in ways more attuned to the transformed world in which we live. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're really lucky to have Dr. Vandemoortele here with us today. He's a man often talked about not just as one of the architects of the MDG, but one of the fathers of the MDGs. So in that sense, I think it's only appropriate that when a child's scorecard has been as controversial and as inconclusive as the MDGs has been, that we ask one of the parents, what's gone wrong and maybe where improvement might be needed. Jan Vandemoortele has had a very distinguished international career. He served in various capacities with the United Nations for the last 30 years. He was UN resident and humanitarian coordinator to Pakistan from 2005 to 8. He was director of the poverty group at the United Nations Development Program in New York from 2001 to 2005. It was during that period that he was the co-architect, and I would even say again the father of the Millennium Development Goals. Between 1995 and 2001, he was chief of social policy at UNICEF. And in the early 1990s, he served as UNDP senior economist in Africa. In the 1980s also, Dr. Vandemoortele worked for the International Labour Organization. He holds a PhD in development economics and publishes regularly in journals and books. And he's a regular speaker as he is today at many international conferences, and he frequently lectures in universities around Europe and the wider world. Ladies and gentlemen, I would not like to take up any more of our precious time. I'm sure I'm just as eager to hear from him as many in the audience are. If not the MDGs, then what? Dr. Vandemoortele.
Thank you well, Ola, and I will stand up because speaking while I'm sitting is kind of too passive for me. So if you allow me to come here, I have a few slides, and I want to get you through three main parts of my presentation. The first one is mostly what the MDGs are not, because 10 years after we put them together, if I feel it's my duty not to tell the people what the MDGs are, I have to tell the audience what they are not, because there's so many misunderstandings. The second part, shortly, will be the global state of affairs on the MDGs. Where are we? Are we going to make it? And how far have we failed? And then the last part, perhaps the most interesting thing, what should they look like beyond 2015? And how do we get to a new framework by 2015? So the slide should come up here. Yes, there's no way of putting some lights out in the front to the organizers because the contrast is a bit light here. But I start off, noblesse oblige, with Kapuscinsky. When I lived in Ethiopia in the 80s, one of the wonderful books I got to read was The Emperor. And Kapuscinsky wrote about the final days of the Emperor. Yeah, that's wonderful. Emperor Haile Selassie. And about 10 years ago, the Kapuscinsky wrote in a newspaper article, I think it was the New York Times at the time, in 2002, he said, one of the developed world's greatest problems today is the indifference to third world countries. And he added, we might listen to ethnic music and travel to exotic places, but really, he says, we aren't much interested in what happens in those places. And now I want to see whether the MDGs, 10 years later, more or less, have made a difference to his main proposition. And in a sense, I would perhaps dare to say yes. Not in a big way, but in at least one way. No, this is not a presentation. This is, anyway, this is the old one. This is the old one. Apologies, yeah. This is the old one. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, yeah, that one. Okay. Yeah, start that one and start it. Yeah, good. Yeah, okay, good, good. Thanks. Okay, there we go. So now the scorecard of the MDGs. The plus and the minuses. On the MDG plus side, we can say that they have definitely enhanced the dialogue, the debate about development. And we hear that also in the media. We read about the MDGs, journalists talk about this, politicians speak it up, preachers talk about it. It certainly increased our debate about development issues. They have been useful for all sorts of stakeholders to exercise some pressure for their cause. Mostly NGOs, but also academics, etc. They have definitely improved the statistics we have available today on development. Much better today than 10, 20 years ago. Far from perfect, but definitely better. And finally, we can also say with some order of certainty that they have increased the amount of monies available for those basic social services, both from donor sides and from the national governments in developing countries. Of course, there is the fundamental attribution problem. Is this due to MDGs or not? Scientifically, we can never make that certain attribution, but there is certainly a correlation and a strong one. On the negative side, however, there is the MDG imbalance in that they are very much squeezed towards the rich countries. Because of the 8 MDGs, 7 apply to developing countries, 1 applies to developed countries. And the one that applies to the developed countries is a very fuzzy one. It's the targets as such are very fuzzily formulated. The second negative is that in the debate about the MDGs, politics has been taken out of it. It has turned into too much of a technocratic debate. And in essence, there is no techno-fix for what are deep down political issues about development at the national level. And the third negative, the last one, is that the conventional narrative still prevails. We'll come to that in a minute. But one of the objectives of the MDGs was to broaden the narrative about development beyond the economic growth narrative. That it was more than growing your economy, it was also about getting better education, better health, better nutrition, etc. around. Now, recently, just earlier this year, there has been a survey done in developing countries, mostly of civil society leaders, about the MDGs. It's called the 100 Voices, Southern Perspectives of what should come after the MDGs. And 2 quick lines there. 75% of the people interviewed agreed with the statement that the MDGs were, quote, a good thing, unquote. Many of them had problems with the MDGs, whatever it is, but overall they said it was a good thing, and perhaps more importantly, about 90% say that beyond 2015, yes, we want to have something like that, a globally agreed framework for development. It has served us, and we want to continue it. So very few people say, let's stop this nonsense. We have had enough of it. It's too imperfect. So this is a voice from the South, not from the North, as we are sitting here. Now, 5 misunderstandings about the MDGs. That is the part about what the MDGs are not. The first one, very common mistake, is that the MDGs have to be reached by each and every country. And then we make league tables and we make world maps and we color the countries either in green when they are on track, in orange when they are close to it, and in red when they are not meeting the targets. And this, of course, was never meant to be the case, that each and every country would meet the MDGs, because we don't have to. Why? The question that is very seldom asked is, why do the MDGs differ from one area to the other? When we talk about nutrition, we say halving hunger. When we talk about infant mortality, we say reducing by 2/3. And when we talk about maternal mortality, we say reducing by 3/4. Why? Why don't we want to reduce poverty by 3/4? It's only half. Why not reduce everything by 3/4? It's more ambitious, and then we don't have to make the mental effort to remembering what belongs where. Because after all, the UN is a bureaucratic organization, so let's keep it simple. Well, there is a reason for it. And I'm going to explain you this one here. Two key statistics, indicators of the MDGs. Under 5 mortality rate, the risk of dying before your 5th birthday, and the net enrollment ratio, the percentage of children enrolled in school. Let's start with this one. In 1960, 48% of the children in developing countries were enrolled in primary school. And it steadily increased to 79% in 1990, which is the base year for the MDGs. If you extrapolate this trend, you get to 100 in 2015. That is why the MDGs call for education for all by 2015. They do not call for halving the proportion of children without access to education, like the water target is formulated. No, they say education for all. Under 5 mortality, in 1960, 223 children died before their 5th birthday out of each 1,000 live births, which means 23.3% of the children didn't make it to their 5th birthday. Came down steadily to about 10%, 103 per 1,000 live births. If you extend the trend from the 70s and the 80s up to 2015, you get to 34. If you take your calculator and you divide 34 by 103, you get exactly 1/3. That is why the MDGs, when it comes to infant and under 5 mortality, call for a reduction, not by 1/2, not by 3/4, but by 2/3. This is all based on global trends. Yeah? This is not based on country trends, which means that collectively, if we can maintain the speed of progress that we collectively, the world, has realized in the 70s and the 80s, and maintain that for the 90s and the 2000, by 2015, bingo, that is where we can be. So that's the basic premise of the MDGs. Always based on global trends. Because if you were to track the trends of Africa in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, for Africa, it would be very different. The slope would be very different. If you were to do that for Latin America, it would be very different. They were based on global trends, all countries together. So you cannot then base the global trends and impose them on each and every region or each and every country, and then say, this is where you have to reach. Now, the same principle has to apply. Is the rate of progress that we are making in a particular country or a specific region, is it going at the same rate of progress that that particular region or country made in the 70s and in the 80s? That is the principle by which we should be coloring world maps if we want to do that. But nobody has done that. Second misunderstanding. No, I'm going to skip this one. Second misunderstanding. They are aspirational. We know we are not going to meet the MDGs. And people say, yeah, but that's okay, because they are aspirational. But they are not aspirational. They are very feasible, because they are based on the achievements that we have realized collectively in the 70s and the 80s. And there is really no reason, there is no excuse why we couldn't maintain that rate of progress of the 70s and the 80s. So they're not aspirational, they're very feasible. Third mistake, they are about as difficult or as easy to achieve for all countries. Mistake. Again, a bit of statistics now, but I know you are familiar with statistics. Sit back, relax, it's not too difficult. We stay with under 5 mortality rate, which is perhaps the single best indicator of all the MDGs. If you have to choose one indicator of all development, my recommendation is use U5MR. But I hasten to add, never use only one. Use several of them. But we stay here with under 5 mortality. Progress in absolute terms between 1990 and 2008, for the last year for which we have available for all countries. And all the countries are here. The number of observation is 192. So all the countries in the world have it here. What do we do? On the horizontal axis, we put the under 5 mortality that prevailed in 1990. And on the vertical axis, we put the change in under 5 mortality between 1990 and today, 2008. The good news is that most countries fall below the horizontal axis. That's the good news. So the majority of countries has seen a reduction in under 5 mortality. We have, however, about a dozen countries that are either on the line or above the line, which means under 5 mortality has increased in those countries. These are mostly countries heavily affected by HIV and AIDS. There's nothing magic there. Haiti is here, Vanuatu, South Africa, Zambia, Kenya, they belong to here. But the majority are below. Two examples. This one here, this is a green dot, I don't know whether you see it. That's Mali in West Africa. Mali used to have 250 under 5 mortality in 1990 and came down by 52 points. It's now less than 200. That's Mali. And then you have that country there, which is your good country, Spain. It's a big country, but it has a small spot there because it's in good company. It's overlapping with several other countries. We'll come to that in a minute. And then you ask your computer, give me a trend line. And then this line appears. And the trend line is going down, which is nothing new. What the trend line says is that the higher the initial level of under 5 mortality was in 1990, the larger the reduction in under 5 mortality has been since 1990. It's normal. There's nothing new about that. Now we look at that same set of data, but now instead of using absolute change on the vertical axis, we use proportional change. Has the under 5 mortality fallen by 25%, 50%, 75%, or by 100%? The same number of countries, 192. Everything the same. Mali is here. We stay with Mali. Remember, it had 250 under 5 mortality in 1990. It fell by about 52 points, which is just over 22%. That is where Mali is. Now, remember, Spain was there. Now, Spain has kind of split in 3 balls because Spain was absolutely overlapping with 3 other countries in the previous one, with UK, with Belgium, my own country, and then Spain. And that is Spain. Spain has done the best. Your under 5 mortality was 9 in 1990 and is now 4. So it has been reduced by about 55%, more or less. Belgium has reduced it by 50%. The UK has reduced it by 33%. And then you ask your computer, give me a trend line. And then the trend line comes up and you say, ooh, it's not sloping down anymore, as in the previous diagram. No, it's sloping up, which means that the higher the initial level of under 5 mortality was in 1990, the smaller the percentage change has been since 1990. That's what this diagram says. Now, these are 2 ways of examining progress. Absolute terms, relative terms. I'm not going to make any argument in favor of one or the other. Actually, it's good to look at the two, because any single look gives a particular perspective and misses out a few dimensions. But coming back to the MDGs, how are the MDGs formulated? The MDGs are mostly formulated in relative terms, in percentage reduction, not in absolute reduction. It's for U5MR, it's reducing by 2/3 between 1990 and 2015. It's in this way, which means then, as we can see, most of the countries that are on track for meeting the U5MR are the countries that started from low levels of U5MR. And the countries that started from middle and high levels of U5MR seem to have a much harder time to reach that. Even Mali, which achieved a major improvement, it came down from 250 to 200, which is not small, is no way near meeting the MDGs. Although its reduction in absolute terms is much larger. So it seems that there is a built-in uneven-handedness in the MDGs, that because they are formulated mostly in relative terms, they are much more difficult to be reached by the countries that start from a low level of human development. That's an inherent problem with the MDGs that we cannot negate. Quickly, the fourth misunderstanding, very commonly heard, is that they include too many gaps. There are too many things missing from the MDGs. There is nothing about good governance, about democracy, about the quality of education, about the rate of economic growth, about infrastructure development, investments, etc., 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 whatever perspective you give. And then those people mostly call for, we need an MDG plus. But nobody is really venturing on defining what the plus means, except that most of the cases you know that their issue should be included. But the plus can be a big plus or a small plus. And the final misunderstanding is that they should include the strategy for meeting the MDGs. That this is a main failure of the MDGs. The MDGs give us the destination, but they don't give us the roadmap. And next time around, we have to make sure that the roadmap is included. And I'm saying no, wrong. And I'm going to take you back to the 17th century, since we are in a historic city, and I can do that here. I take you back to New Delhi in the time of the Mughal, Shah Jahan, who lived and reigned in the 17th century. And as you know, he was married and he had 14 children. And when the 14th one was born, his wife died in childbirth in 1631. And he was a distraught man. And what did he do? He built a mausoleum for her. And the shrine is still standing. And several of you probably have already visited it. It's the Taj Mahal. Yeah? At the same time, there was, in another part of the world, this lady, Ulrika Eleonora of Denmark. She was the queen of Sweden and Finland. History in Scandinavia is a bit complex. You know, these things, the countries that we know today were not always the way they were then. She lived a bit later in the same century. She had 7 children of her own. She didn't die in childbirth, but she saw so many mothers die from maternal mortality around her. What did she do? She established the first known school for midwives in Stockholm. So you have 2 different leaders faced with the same problem being maternal mortality. One builds a shrine and a mausoleum, and the other one starts the first school for midwifery. In those days, of course, they didn't have external advisors like our good selves. They didn't call on the UN or on think tanks to come and advise them. But it's not totally inconceivable that the advisors today would side with the Shah and not with the Queen. Because they would tell the Shah, this is the right thing you're doing. You're investing in infrastructure, which is going to earn you a lot of foreign exchange, which will accelerate economic growth, and that will somehow reduce maternal mortality. And they would tell the Queen, this is all public investment, this is adding to the budget deficit, you should take a different approach. But that aside, it was not so much the action of those two individuals that is important here, but the mindset with which they approached it. For the Shah, maternal mortality was kind of a given. It was deplorable, but it was accepted. It was an act of nature, of an act of God, of whatever. But the Queen, her mindset was very different. The Queen said, no way. Mothers should no longer be the victims of maternal mortality. We can do something about it. And it's not in the hands of nature or deities to decide whether those mothers are going to die. And she took affirmative action. All this to tell you that a Spanish poet already 100 years ago told us about the strategy towards meeting the MDGs. And he says, no hay camino, se hace camino al andar. Development is basically a process of collective discovery. This is true for Spain, this is true for Belgium, this is true for any developing country today. And it would be wrong to impose any single one strategy on reaching the MDGs the next time around. So quickly, the 5 corrections is that the MDGs are collective targets, not individual targets for each country, and they are based on global trends for the 60s and for the 70s and the 80s. They are feasible. There are no excuses. Yeah? They are not aspirational, or they don't express a normative, ideal world. Not at all. They are hardest to achieve in the countries that have the lowest level of initial human development. They are illustrative, not exhaustive. So I agree there are many things missing in the MDGs, but if we overload the MDGs, they will implode under their own weight. You have to be illustrative and selective, and they represent ends. You leave the means outside. The means are to be decided at the country level by the stakeholders over there. Now, what is the global state of affair on MDGs? Quickly, taking, in my view, the best indicators that we have. This is for all developing countries. Between 2000, the first green bar is the rate in 1990, and this is the rate in 2008. So this is the beginning of the period, this is the latest. Underweight is something we don't want to have, so this has to come down, and it came down from 31% to 26%, minus 5 percentage points. Primary school enrollment went up from 82% to 89%, plus 7 points. The percentage of girls going to primary school went up by 5 percentage points. We are almost at the parity level. Child mortality is something we don't want, so it has to come down. 10% of the children died in 1990 in the world. 7% die today, before their 5th birthday. And finally, 2 more, measles immunization, major progress. The rate of the coverage of measles immunization went up by 11 percentage points, and the percentage of births attended by skilled health staff, being doctors, nurses, midwives, went up by 10 percentage points. So we can say that on all the MDGs, the world made progress. On the average, you can say that the world is a better place today than it was in 1990. All those indicators have gone in the right direction. Of course, the question is, did this go fast enough? And it didn't. This is the summary of some of those same indicators for the global scorecard in 2008. Here, if we were to be on track, the green bars, the achieved part, should get much closer to the dotted line in order for us to say that we will meet the target in 2015. The closest we get is on gender parity in primary school. But nobody in this room will then say that we are okay on gender discrimination, that we are solving it. No way. But you can see that on health, on education, on underweight, we are off track. The one-sentence summary you can make on all the databases of the MDGs is that we have covered 1/3 of the road, but it has taken us 2/3 of the time. Which means we have 2/3 of the road to go, but we have only 1/3 of the time left. So we have been driving in second gear, and we should have been driving in fourth gear. That's the summary of all the MDG statistics that we have. We are making progress, we are not regressing, and I think that's important to underscore. Everything is going in the right direction, but it's going too slow. Many people will say, yeah, this is due to Africa. Africa is the millstone around our neck. If Africa were to perform at par, then the world would meet the MDGs. This is a very common statement that you hear all over, including from reports in the UN. So quickly, we go and look at the state of affairs in Africa for the same indicators. Only sub-Saharan Africa now. Underweight, it has come down by 4 percentage points. In brackets here is the amount for all developing countries that we saw in the previous diagram. So -4 for Africa is similar to what all developing countries have achieved on underweight. So more or less the same. On primary school enrollment, Africa has seen an 18 percentage point increase. Much faster than all countries together. So Africa is doing much better on education. Percentage of girls in school, +6%, the same as the rest of the developing countries. Child mortality, -4, more or less the same as the rest of developing countries. Measles immunization, +17%. Again, much better than all developing countries taken together. Deliveries, +5%, a major gap with the rest of the world. That's an area where Africa is lagging. But overall, it is wrong to argue that Africa is slowing down global progress. Africa is making its fair contribution, more than fair contribution, to meeting the collective targets of 2015. Of course, Africa started at a much lower level of human development. So for them to jump to the global targets, of course, is illusionary. And if we dismiss the importance of initial conditions, well, then I'm going home. Then there is no more point in discussion. And yet, you read reports like this one, the Blair Commission report. Many of us have had to chew on that one in 2005. When it came out, it was about 700 pages. It was a big one. And I'm quoting here a sentence. And I didn't pick any sentence in that 700-page report. This is the opening sentence. I'm giving you the opening sentence of that report. And it says, African poverty and stagnation is the greatest tragedy of our time. Poverty, I don't want to dispute that. But stagnation, after what we have seen, this is factually wrong. There hasn't been any stagnation in Africa. Africa has made major progress. So you see how unfair this is. So the next time somebody tells you that Africa is missing the targets, you have to answer that person that no, Africa is not missing the targets, you are missing the point. The point being that Africa cannot, will not, and must not reach the MDGs for the world to meet the MDGs. Because there are other countries, like Chile, like Thailand, like Vietnam, that are way above the MDGs. So, as in class, when we have a global scorecard in class, half the students in the class have above the bar, and half the students are below the bar. So this is important to emphasize. Now, the 8th goal. Don't forget the 8th goal, because we have been talking about the first 7 goals for developing countries. There's also the 8th goal for us, the North. And this has mainly 4 aspects to it: debt relief, ODA, official development assistance, which we call foreign aid, our trade policy and our patent laws, and our global governance. How have we been doing? On debt relief, I think we can, the developed countries can claim that they have passed the test. The debt crisis today is much less crippling for developing countries than it was 10, 15 years ago. So, hat off, passing grade, not with distinction, but passing grade. Since we are at university, we go with this analogy. On ODA, foreign aid, yeah, they did an honest effort, but they have to retake the exam. It was a good effort, Spain included, but way inadequate. We are way far from 0.7. So there we take retake the exam. When it comes to trade policy, failing grade. You don't even retake the exam because you have not shown any intention of learning and of changing. So you go and you repeat the year. The global trading system and our patent laws are simply Europe included, and the North, Japan and the US, are advocating on developing countries, is simply unfit for purpose when it comes to the MDGs. And the global governance, when it comes to how do we rule the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN, where I spend my life, there has not been any change. There is still a very donor-centric way of looking at those organizations and failing it. So we are not meeting the 7 first goals, but we are not even close to making any progress on the 8 goals, apart for debt relief. But for the rest, it is not good. There was the summit last year in September, and indeed there was some good language in that agreement. But one criteria for judging any of those international agreements is brevity. Brevity, how long the document is. And I checked it out. And the report that was agreed last year in September is considerably longer than the initial document, which was called the Millennium Declaration. It's actually 4 times longer. If you need 4 times more words to explain what you're going to do, it really means you either don't have it clear in your mind or you don't want to. There are in that document 124 commitments. So world leaders say, we commit to. And if you add them all up, there are 124. Well, if you have 124 priorities, it means you really don't have any priority. But there is some good language. There is some good language on the international financial transaction, on gender equality. There are a few areas that were good, but overall not good. And the most important thing, it's the same old narrative, the same old discourse, which is the 3 ingredients. The equation here is that if only we could accelerate economic growth, increase foreign aid, and improve governance, bingo. Equal to MDGs. That's where we will get. That has been the narrative, most of the cases. With economic growth, of course, being the primary one. I have nothing against those 3 things. They are very helpful. But by themselves, they cannot get us there. Why not? Because we have seen improvements in those 3 areas for the past 20, 30 years. And they haven't gotten us anywhere close to the MDGs. What the unconventional evidence shows is also 3 elements. And that has not been debated in the MDG summit last September, is that within country inequalities are making the MDGs mission impossible, because the progress that the countries are achieving is bypassing the lowest quintiles, the poorest people, the most disadvantaged people. Second one, that our global trading system and our TRIPS, our trade-related intellectual property rights, are still the same, not fit for purpose, and that climate change are really jeopardizing global progress. Somebody standing here in 25 years' time, if we don't address those three things, will not be able to demonstrate with the statistics all the green bars that the world is making progress. We will have reversals in many of those areas. And the more you look at the MDGs, like these school children, they have read all the reports on the MDGs, and all the statistics, the more you look at them, is that the secret meaning of the MDGs is not Millennium Development Goals. There is, it's like the Da Vinci Code. They have discovered the secret meaning of the MDGs. And it is, in my view, you will not see it probably because behind the chairs, MDGs is minding the development gaps. As long as we are not ready to address the issue of growing disparities within countries, there is no way we will ever get to meet those targets. No matter the amount of economic growth, no matter the amount of foreign aid, and no matter good governance becomes in those countries. We have to address this. And of course, politically, it's a bit, it's touchy. But growing inequalities within countries, China, Vietnam, all over the place, that's the picture you get. The widening disparities among the countries is making the MDGs mission impossible. So an ideal set, I'm coming to the end of it. How would the MDGs ideally look beyond 2015? Let's idealize now the world and say that the world leaders are going to be very rational people and they are going to listen to us. So the first one is they have to be concise, yet they have to be comprehensive. They have to be measurable, yet they have to include agreed principles, mostly principles of human rights. They have to be simple, yet they have to reflect the complexity of development. They have to be country-specific, yet they have to be universal. They have to express ends, and, if possible, they should also try to explain the means. It's very obvious this is impossible. So we have to make choices. What are the choices to be made? We have to revise the structure. We have to revise the structure as we have them today. Just one example. Of the 8 goals, 3 of them relate to health. There is one for child mortality, there's one for maternal mortality, and then there's one for the diseases. This has more to do with the structure of the UN than really an international agenda. I can say that. I lived there for 30 years. Because UNICEF is child, UNFPA is maternal, and WHO takes care of the diseases. So they each one got their little thing. So why not collapse those 3 into one health goal, like we have one education goal with relevant targets, and then we have space already for 1 or 2 other things that have to be included. The second thing is they have to be formulated very clearly as collective global targets. Stress the need that they need to be adapted at any sub-global level. Stress their measurability, not their perfectibility, because many people aim for the perfect, but once you get into targets that are not measurable, then anybody gets away with fake evidence. And then instead of evidence-based policymaking, we get into a process of policy-based evidence-making. And that exists. We have examples for that. Capture the equity dimension, because we have these growing gaps, which is not being captured today. Focus on the ends and not on the means. And then the final one, how do we deal with this tough issue of collective responsibility and mutual accountability in the international arena? These are concepts we are all dealing with. But they really don't work. We don't have mechanisms for really making concrete and real what it means to have a collective responsibility and a mutual accountability. We have to change the way we do global summitry. Yeah, we have to do that because if you look at a summit like in September, heads of states and government go to those summits. I presume that the Prime Minister of Spain went to New York in September last year and made a speech, 7-minute speech. And so those individuals make their speech to half-empty rooms, and then they walk away. And we call this an international debate on development issues. But they have all, each their speech, 7 minutes. Some go a bit longer. But this is not a debate among world leaders. This is just giving them a forum to raise issues that are mostly important for the national constituency. This is what happens. We have to change this. I'm not undoing the importance of leaders meeting on issues of human development. This is very important. We didn't have that 20, 30 years ago. Now leaders come together and they talk about child mortality and maternal death and nutrition. It's good. But the way we are doing this needs to change. It is no longer fit for purpose. To get them together, this was fine, but we have to create a better sense of debate. And for that, I propose that we establish a peer and partner group. What do I mean by that? Maybe half a dozen or 12 people, high caliber people, led by the South, not again by the North, who are ready and willing to challenge the conventional wisdom. I'm going to mention just one name, but President Lula could be in that group. And people from the media world, from the business world, from academia, from all over the place, various stakeholders, really people of that caliber, where world leaders will look up to and will listen to and say, this person means no evil, we are going to listen to him or to her. Have that group, and for them to generate between now and 2013, because last year the world leaders agreed to come together again in 2013. Which is not long from now, for that peer and partner group to generate a few proposals of how these post-2015 framework would look like, based on wide consultation and also a bit of thinking, because sometimes the thinking part is forgotten. So then they can table in 2013 to the General Assembly, where our countries are going to debate the future of the MDGs. But the political debate will at least start from an informed basis. These people will have gone through some of the complexities I was showing you. Is it relative progress or is it absolute progress? How do we handle those things? And they present them. Then next time around, when we have MDGs for 25 years hence, then targets that are 25 years ahead of us have no political accountability in them. I come from Belgium. My country is in the news once in a while for no good reasons, as you know. It's the ultimate failed state. It's falling apart, and it's likely to fall apart. So my ambition is to be, by 2015, the President of the Republic of Flanders. And I will go to New York, and I will happily sign up to any set of MDGs for the year 2045. Happily, because it's not going to be on my watch. Who cares? I'm going to come and I will go home and I will say, look, this new president here, I'm doing it for you. But if it's going to be on your watch as a political leader, then you're going to be more careful before you sign the dotted line. So what we can do then is we set goals for 25 years hence, yes, okay, but then we build back interim targets as stepping stones towards this long-term target. And that can be interim targets for every 5 years. So when you sign tomorrow as head of state, of government, you know that in 5 years' time, you will be there again, and they will ask you, what have you contributed to that target? Have you made it? Because now it's not anything fuzzy in the distant future, it's going to be with us. And the final one is then, beyond 2015, this peer and partner group, again led by the South, not by the donors, has then to play the role of global custodian of the MDGs. We are missing this, because then this global custodian, which has the moral high ground, can then make sure that these fuzzy concepts of collective responsibility and mutual accountability get some concrete meat around the bone. And they can then do that similar to how our human rights treaties are being monitored. Countries that ratify a human rights instrument every 5 years are being reviewed, as you know, including Spain, including Belgium. And then there is a panel of experts who objectively give you a state of affairs and give you recommendation. A bit the same spirit, but then not individually, country by country, but then collectively. All countries together come to New York, then you have this peer and partner group, high caliber people, and then they manage the debate. And then it's no longer a series of independent speeches given by those 192 world leaders who have nothing in common with each other. And they speak parallel to each other, and there is no debate. So I think for 2015, this is my humble recommendation. We have little time to do that because the clock is ticking, but I really hope that next time around, it's not going to be the same exercise as last time. And I happened to be in the room last time. And it's not that way. It should not be a series of technocrats and donor representatives dictating the global agenda for development. This time around, it should come more from the bottom up, led by the South. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jan. Very fascinating presentation. I'm sure the audience, can contain themselves to pose some really challenging questions to you. But before then, I would like to give the floor to Sylvia to maybe say one or two things on the lectures we've just heard.
Yes, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and Jan Vandemoortele for his brilliant presentation. Actually, I'm just going to make a couple of comments from the perspective of an evaluator that it mainly works right now in the field. Although I did work in the 90s in the European Commission, and I know how initially they were very much donor-driven, and the OECD was even involved in trying to establish targets. So when the MDGs were defined and came up, we were actually very happy, but it was very much the donors being or pulling the wagon. When I was asked actually to comment and to come today, I thought back to the MDGs as something very much historical, because I haven't heard of the MDGs in recent years, which could be a good thing, because I've been working at the country level. And as we've seen, it's not always good to look at things that are meant to be global, specifically at a country basis, especially in contexts like the one I've been mostly involved with now in Haiti, where, I mean, you can actually leave the room if you want to achieve the MDGs. So it's not very even aspirational sometimes when one is considering what one does. But I would be also one of among the 75% that would agree that the MDGs were a good thing, and I think that they've actually been a very huge thing, because they've provided a lot of momentum within the international community to discuss development issues. Being in the position of donors, I know that they put a lot of pressure on donors to commit to certain benchmarks that were defined. If one looks at websites and this could be good or bad when you see what Blair's comments were on Africa. But everyone is always, I mean, the reference is to the MDGs. It still is at the donor level. The problem for people who are in the beginning of this decade was that when you were an evaluator or when donors were creating their plans, is that since they were basing themselves on the MDGs, there was this pressure to look at the MDGs at a national level, and that sometimes created a lot of imbalances. I mean, I can give a lot of examples, but even in cases like Morocco, the Spanish cooperation, but they've not been the only ones at all. It helped them align and coordinate to look at the MDGs, but in practice, this was then broken down by sectors and even by programs and then by projects, and even NGOs had to report back on how they were achieving the MDGs. And then as evaluators, we looked at the targets and found that the indicators were troublesome, not only because they weren't always measurable or attainable, or you couldn't even take stock of progress because they weren't absolute, as we said, but by percentages of increases. But even because school enrollment sometimes means very little, because you find that everyone is enrolled, but then when you go to see the school, and the school isn't actually operating. So there are a lot of things that now with hindsight that we know about what works and what doesn't and why, and looking forward, it would be very important to consider everything that's been, all of the lessons that have come out of this process. So I think that that it'll be very important that in the future, based on this presentation and other lessons that have come out and criticisms, that we think, okay, what are the goals that we have with something like the MDGs? And in Spanish, it would be the objectives of the objectives, but it is, and people would think, no, but those are, I mean, the goals are the targets, but it's not really that, because it's all about the process and other things. So I'm actually very enthusiastic thinking ahead and forward on how things can be improved, and especially issues like the inequity can be tackled, and maybe even more indicators on women's empowerment, because there's that inequality as well. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Debo decir que si hay personas aquí que tienen cuestiones en español, estarán bienvenidas, porque me parece que tenemos traductores aquí. No tiene que decirlo en inglés. Yo tampoco hablo bien español, discúlpame, quizás el año que viene sería muchísimo mejor. So yeah, I think, Jan, we take a first round of questions, and you know, there would be opportunity for people who don't get the chance to do in the first round. The hands are flying up on my right, so we take 1, 2, and then we take the third one. Thank you.
Hello, good night. I'm Javier Perez from a newborn Spanish think tank called CIECODE, based on trade and development. And my question is, it would be very interesting to know your opinion on what new issues could be included in a potential new framework of a MDG+, and if it could be something related with private sector, that is related with many of the actual MDGs, but I don't know if given the importance of private sector in development and investors, and so I don't know if in the discussions that you're having on the new framework, or if not, to know your opinion in general. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Victoria from the Center on Economic and Social Rights. It was alluded to before, but the world is much different today than it was 10 years ago. We have things like increasing urbanization, climate change, but most importantly, what has really affected and had repercussions for the MDGs is the post-financial crisis context in which we're in now. Increasingly, you see importance being placed on, well, the consequences of the crisis, and not only in terms of perhaps putting the goals back and having the progress that has been made on the goals being reversed, but also in terms of changes in perceptions on what is important. For example, now you have an emerging initiative, the social protection floor. It'd be interesting to see how that feeds into what the post-2015 content will actually be. Also, the Arab uprisings recently have showed us how important job protection is, for example, rising food prices. So I'd like to know a little bit about your opinion on what the post-2015 agenda should be in light of the changing context in which we live, both in terms of the content, but also in terms of meeting the goals by 2015. How can we meet the goals given these obstacles and post-financial context? Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Vandemoortele. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Isabella Trübel. I work at the Austrian Embassy here in Madrid, and I'm in charge of EU affairs and development cooperation. And I'm very much interested in what you mentioned about the conventional narrative, which is still there. Do you think you didn't really give any clues to how we could do away with that? Do you think there will be, so to speak, a biological solution for that? Because people will just, young people coming and won't think that way anymore? Or is there any other way how we could tackle that? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I see there a few hands coming up. I think Jan might want to take those three questions first. Am I allowed to abuse my position as chair? Just two really quick ones, because somebody asked about the importance of job protection in the context of uprising in the Arab world, and also another question about the conventional understanding. The question I wanted to ask is that adjusting for all those things you referred to in your presentation as the oft ignored conventional evidence, what role do you think economic growth has to play, if there is any at all, in achieving poverty reduction and the wider MDGs? The second thing I wanted to ask, and this also is related to some of the questions that have been asked there, you were very much involved with the process, of designing this from the start. What were the people thinking about? The whole MDG objectives were started in 2000. Why would you use 1990 as a baseline? You're already 10 years past the starting point. It just didn't make any sense to me. If you would like to help.
Thank you. This is working, yeah? You hear me? Yeah. Yeah, this is definitely an informed public audience here. And I will only add a few humble opinions. I don't have the solution to that, except perhaps for the last question, Ola, that your question, the history of the MDGs. And there it's very clear. And let me remind you, for those who have forgotten, I take you back 22 years, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Until then, the UN was totally polarized and was not able to move much. Everything was east-west, and everything was politically incorrect, whatever you did. The Berlin Wall falls, and pretty quickly, the UN is able to convene global summits on the important issues of what we call human development today. It starts already in 1990, a year after the fall of the wall, with education and with the Children's Summit by the UN. And then it goes on, Rio, the Earth Summit, some of you may remember, Copenhagen, the Social Summit, Vienna, the Human Rights Summit, Cairo, the Population and Development Summit, Istanbul, was it Istanbul? Yes, I think so, housing, settlements and things. So it went on in those years, 1990s. Then comes the millennium. And of course, we were all around then. You had to do something special for the millennium. So the UN, in a very imaginative way, they call the Millennium Summit together, because they didn't have any other idea. And so we have the Millennium Summit. And what does the Millennium Summit do? It really summarizes, it synthesizes the major commitments that are made, that had been made in those sectoral meetings in the previous 10 years. This is what it's, so in a sense, it's the mother of all summits, the Millennium Summits, because it synthesizes all those specific commitments on reducing poverty, reducing hunger, child mortality, maternal mortality, everything else. And that is why the base year is going back to 1990. Because all those sectoral summits that took place in 1990 and 1992 and 1994 and 1995, etc., all set individual sector-specific targets based on 1990 as the base year. So that's true. We come out in 2000 with a series of targets that start 10 years early. It's a bit odd. It's a bit odd, but that's the history of it. And so that's why 2015 then? Because when you add 25 years to 1990, you get to 2015. 25 years is the normal period for what we call a generation. Our generation will achieve those things. That was kind of the idea. And I think that will probably prevail as we go in the future. Now, the new issues of the MDG Plus, there is a long list of them. It depends on who you talk to. It's, so Lula and company have a lot of work to do in terms of prioritizing. I'm not going to do that for them. Private sector is definitely one of those ideas that is being tabled. Economic growth as well. The only solution out of this conundrum is to focus solely on the ultimate ends, on the ultimate aims. Only set a target for the ultimate outcome, not for the means and the process. So when you say, I'm going to reduce under 5 mortality by whatever, and that, I think, from a human rights perspective, that's an ultimate outcome. That's a desirable achievement we want to see realized across the world. But exactly how we are going to get there is another matter. Economic growth is a means towards getting there, a very valuable means, but it's only a means. Private sector development is also a means towards getting there. And I would refrain from setting targets for those issues. Because then we interfere in the domain of national policy making of how to reach our own targets, each country individually. And in some countries, in economic growth will be much less important, like India, to reach it than it is for Chad, for instance. I'm just giving 2 examples. So focus on the ends and let the means be the cooking as countries aim for that. The same thing for social protection. Social protection is an approach to development. And also it would be useful if we focus on targets that are conceptually clear. Yeah? When we say reducing under 5 mortality, this is pretty clear. We have a good indicator and it's neatly defined. We know what we are talking about. When we say a target for poverty reduction, this is very fuzzy. What does poverty mean? Yeah? We have tried to get around this by defining the international norm of $1.25 per day. But that is highly debatable. Social protection is one of those words that is coming up in many fora, and I'm all for it. I worked long enough for UNICEF. But first of all, it is an approach towards doing things like Bolsa Escola or Bolsa Familiar in Brazil is a good example for that, but there are many other forms, and what is social protection and what is not social protection? It would be neat for us to agree that we avoid targets for which the concept is fuzzy, the indicators are lousy, and the data is unreliable. And unfortunately, within the MDGs set, we still have too many of those. The concept is not clear, the indicator is highly questionable, and the data is totally unreliable. And if you have that, if we allow this thing to prevail, and I'm sure it will because of political reasons, but why do I do that? I don't say that because my PhD was in econometrics and I like numbers. It's nothing to do with statistics, it's all to do with politics. Because if your concept is not clear, and your indicator is so-so, and your data is unreliable, then people are able to make up any evidence that suits their argument. And everybody is entitled to their opinion, but we are not entitled to making up our own facts. And this is what's happening today. For you will read in many reports on the MDGs that the world is on track for 3 of the targets. The first one is the poverty target. The second one is the water target. And the third one is the urban slum target. This is about statistical illusion. None of them are valid. You cannot academically, rigorously make an argument for either of those 3. Slums, for instance, let's take that one. We have a target for slums, but we don't know what a slum is. There is no agreed definition of a slum. So we don't need where the slum starts and where the slum ends. So it doesn't matter how much effort you put into improving your statistical work to measuring. If you don't have clarity about the concept, it's unmeasurable. And then you make claims that are totally fictitious. We do the same claim about poverty reduction, totally fictitious. What the conventional narrative, the financial crisis, no excuses. These are false excuses for 2 reasons. The first one is we see that the financial crisis in the north has less of an impact on economic performance in the south, and even in Africa. Yeah, China keeps on growing, India keeps on growing, Brazil keeps on growing, and Africa keeps on growing. So our problem is not necessarily their problem, as we speak. And secondly, even if it were also their problem, we are talking about very basic issues. We are talking about very fundamental human rights. Going to primary school. We're not talking about going to university level. We're talking about primary school education. We're talking about reducing under 5 mortality, very basic things that are feasible and affordable in most countries. If you get rapid economic growth and you get a bit of help from a friend in terms of foreign aid, it helps. But it is no excuse for any country to use the financial crisis for, as a justification why we are missing the targets. Conventional narrative, yeah, how do we get there? Well, on the equity one, it seems that we are having a breakthrough. The concerns and the debate about disparities are now becoming less of a forgotten issue. Until recently, when you raised the issue about equity, you were either dismissed as being anecdotal or as being a social engineer. Yeah? Today, most partners agree that there is a real problem with equity. And for those who haven't been checking recently, there is even a working paper out by 2 staff members at IMF. Not immediately the area, the institution where you would expect them to make an argument about equity. And they make a very strong argument in a very well-reasoned piece of analysis that they say the origin of our financial crisis has a lot to do with the growing inequities in our societies. And redistribution policies, that's the verb, that's the term they use. Redistribution policies, they say, are much more effective than bailouts. So that just to give you one example of where this debate on equity is going, what is most disappointing is on the trade issue. There we are not making any progress. And we, Europeans, have to say mea culpa, because as we speak today, the Commission is still imposing those EPAs, economic partnership agreements. They are still imposing those partnership agreements on the developing partners. As we speak, East Africa is in the process of approving it. Uganda is trying to keep its leg stiff and say no, but they will have to give in. If they haven't given in, maybe somebody knows already whether Uganda have given in, but we still continue with this conventional view that open trade is the sole avenue for accelerating progress towards the MDGs. And this has been proven to be a wrong approach. There is a famous academic in Cambridge who has written books on that, and he uses this wonderful image of kicking away the ladder. We have climbed up the economic ladder by subsidizing our economy behind high tariff trades. But now that we have reached the top, we are kicking away the ladder because we are telling all developing countries, you don't subsidize your economy and you certainly don't impose high tariffs on whatever you're doing. That's exactly what we have been doing in our economic history. So I'm not the one that says that. There is good thing. And the role of economic growth, Ola, as I said, yes, very important. Of course, it depends on one area to the other. But just one example. India has had fabulous growth in the past 2 decades. Fabulous growth. Its GDP has more than doubled, GDP per capita. Its underweight has hardly changed in the last 20 years. The percentage of children who are underweight in India is about the same today as it was in 1990. So yes, economic growth, yes, but it's a wrong assumption to think that one is correlated necessarily with the other. And why is it? It's because of those widening disparities. As long as that fabulous economic growth bypasses the bottom 30, 40, 50% of the population, there is no chance for us to meet the MDGs.
Thank you very much, Jan. I think we would open the floor for another set of questions. We've got one in the front, Cristina there.
Gracias. Voy a hablar en español, si no. Mi nombre es Ignacio Soleto, trabajo en una fundación pública del sistema. Todo quiero agradecerle por haber participado en la elaboración de los ODM, que ha servido o sirvió en su momento para poner el tema del desarrollo de la pobreza en la agenda de los políticos y que probablemente gracias a ello se han producido los avances que él ha mencionado en tema de salud, de educación o de igualdad. También quiero agradecerle la claridad con la que ha explicado algunas de las interioridades de cómo y por qué se formularon algunos de los objetivos del Millennium, por ejemplo, el tema de la salud. Mi preocupación tiene que ver con una curiosidad intelectual. Como él bien ha explicado, los ODM no surgen en el año 2000 de la nada, sino que vienen de un largo proceso donde, principalmente en el seno del Comité de Ayuda al Desarrollo, yo creo que es donde se estaban discutiendo lo que entonces no se llamaban Objetivos de Desarrollo Milenio, sino Objetivos de Desarrollo Internacional. Y ahí había 8 objetivos. Estaban los 7 dirigidos a los 7 primeros, que son eso, y había un octavo que tenía que ver con algo de lo que luego desaparecen y se formula un octavo objetivo que aparece en Naciones Unidas. Y era un objetivo clave para hablar de desarrollo, que tenía que ver con la democracia, con la participación y seguramente con la igualdad. Sin embargo, ese objetivo desaparece de la agenda y aparece uno nuevo, que es el ODM8, que tiene que ver con la OD, con el comercio, tecnología y demás, curiosamente sin indicadores. Los otros tienen indicadores, tienen metas, el octavo no tiene metas. Entonces yo quería pues aprovechar que conoce muy bien esas interioridades para decirnos cuál es el problema para que haya desaparecido ese tipo de indicadores. La otra pregunta ya la ha contestado. Yo creo que un tema clave en el desarrollo es la igualdad. Habría que incluirlo y seguramente este octavo objetivo iba en esa dirección y sin embargo desapareció y fue sustituido por este otro. Gracias.
Good evening, Cristina Barrios. I'm a researcher at FRIDE. My maybe one comment and one question. The comment is you have very well underlined this connection between the politics and the technical approach in development policies, but we still see a lot of the focus on technicalities in the development community. So is the development community changing itself? What do you see in the United Nations or OECD and other forums? What we're going to see this year in Busan with the aid effectiveness, is it again technical and not political? So how do you see this? And the other brief question is about state fragility and in general the role of the state, which is something that is not in the development goals. And I think it's because obviously in the 1990s and in 2000 it was also something off the agenda. The state was not in fashion. And is this something that is changing now, and will you see the inclusion of fighting against state fragility as something that is part of the goals or part of the road? Thanks.
In the absence of any more questions for now,
yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's true. The greatest value of the MDG has been its power to communicate what we are doing. And we shouldn't dismiss this because development is complex. And each of us know that. But when you go to grandmother or you go to the 15 seconds CNN moment, you don't have the time to say, well, it depends. Or you have to simplify a bit and have it done. So that's something we have to keep in mind, that this has probably been the greatest, at the risk, of course, of becoming simplistic. That's, of course, always the border case. It has to be simple. It can't become simplistic. DAC was part of the people in the room when we formulated the MDGs, because they had, as you mentioned, the International Development Goals, the 7. There was that 7, and then democracy was heavily influenced. Democracy is also heavily present in the Millennium Declaration, that document that was agreed at the Millennium Summit, out of which we took the MDGs. Because the whole idea of the MDGs was, when a summit takes place, there is a declaration. And everybody is taken by the declaration. There is an agreed text, and in those days we still produced texts that were inspiring. I don't know how many of you have read of late the Millennium Declaration, but it's an inspiring text. It moves you, and it's yeah, I can believe in that. But after 3 months, the Millennium Declaration or any other declaration disappears and ends up in the dustbin of history, because the world moves on, and we use it in every speech and report, but after 3 months it starts to fade away and it disappears. And that is when we came in, 2 people in New York, myself and somebody else. We are having a cappuccino, we didn't read the novel, we had a cappuccino actually in New York, and we said, how can we prevent that this is going to happen again? Because within the Millennium Declaration, there are fundamental commitments there that we cannot lose this time. And we came up with this simple idea of having a group of people come together and go through the text and lift a few individual commitments, verbatim. They are the targets as we have them in the MDGs. The 18 targets are taken literally from the MDG, from the Millennium Declaration. And we set them apart in a different category. That's simple like that. It took us, of course, 6 months because we are many in the UN to agree. DAC was there, the World Bank, IMF, UNICEF, UNCTAD, we were all there, and it took us a little bit. Now, democracy is not there, or good governance is not there. It's very much in the text of the Millennium Declaration. It's not in the MDGs. I must say I am partly responsible for that, because my role was to play the role of gatekeeper. Go through the text, and I had very simple question. And I said, when anybody says, yeah, let's include this thing into the MDGs, my role was to ask them, what is your indicator and where is the global data to track progress? And of course, when the answer to that was fuzzy, I said, no, sorry, you're not in. That is why the quality of education is not part of it. And as you mentioned, Sylvia, it's very important. Nobody is going to argue that the quality of education is not important. But you ask the experts, I don't know whether there is any educationalist in the room, but they will never agree of how exactly do you define quality of education and how do you measure it. So, out. And when we came to good governance and democracy, I didn't get a good answer from the specialist. And so we had to say, you work on it, and next time around, we'll talk again. That's the technical aspect of it. Of course, it has a political meaning, because if you include something that is fuzzy, anybody gets away with their own conclusions. But it is also fundamentally to do with what this poet said, that there is no hay camino, se hace el camino al andar. And I may venture, I'm in Spain, so I may venture this statement here that Spain came late to the democratic trend in Europe for whatever historical reasons. But you decided and you got to where you are today because you were the players, you were the actors. Nobody came to Spain to tell you that it was now enough, that it was too autocratic and you had to change. And there was no guy from the UN or from wherever to come, or from Transparency International, to tell you that it was now enough, that the times had changed and it had to be more democratic. And I think we have to be conscious of that lesson, that it comes from within the society. And as external partners, we have an influence, but that influence is very often much less than we want to believe it is. And now to go to countries and impose on them elections, multi-party elections, like we had in the last 6 months, that all went in the wrong direction. Haiti is an example, Kenya, not to talk about Cote d'Ivoire, and the list is long. We have to be open to look and learn lessons from there, and say that maybe we are overbearing a bit. And again, nobody came to Belgium to decide that it was time to turn democratic. Nobody came to Spain to turn that. We did it on our own. You did it, and we did it on our own. And I think we have to we are all for democracy, but the process is important, that we are not coming across, because it always creates the opposite reaction, always. And that's the last thing we want to have. Again, the role of the state, is that changing? Well, I would leave that outside the MDG agenda. Is it the private sector that is in the lead, or is it the government that is in the lead? That will vary from place and by time. With the financial crisis, you would have thought that the private sector would have been humbled a bit, and that many politicians on that side of the aisle would be more cautious, but it doesn't seem to have had any any of the impact. Was it just today that I heard that the finance minister in England, Mr. Osborne, was calling on the Employers' Federation to join them in a fight against the trade unions, as if the trade unions were responsible for the financial crisis, if you comment. So this sense, this political opinions are not necessarily subject to lessons of history. And that's okay, I respect that. But the role of the state, the role of the private sector, let that to be defined. And yes, let it be a political process now. And that's where this peer and partner group should not be a group of technocrats. We technocrats can talk to them and provide them inputs and give them suggestions. But this time around, it has to be the political leaders, the community leaders, the religious leaders, the business leaders, the media, celebrities, so well, not celebrities, but at least some people who have some brains between their ears, to take that. And because another technocratic approach is not going to do us much of a service. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And thanks for that anecdote about Mr. Osborne inviting employers to join them in fighting unions. I don't think they need much invitation anyway. Please, you know, I think we have about 10 minutes to go. So, you know, perhaps one or two more questions. I saw one hand up at the back.
En castellano, pues quiero hacer muchas gracias por la intervención, me ha parecido muy interesante y muy clara. Como han comentado, pues, mi nombre es Mónica García, trabajo en la Organización de Estados Iberoamericanos para la Educación, la Ciencia y la Cultura y tengo especial interés en este tema y me gustaría saber, tener su opinión acerca de cómo se encuentra la cultura detrás de los objetivos del milenio, porque si bien no ha sido ningún objetivo específicamente indicado, la gente que proviene del mundo de la cultura cree que si no se tiene en cuenta este factor, no será posible llegar a buen ritmo y a buen término a conseguir los objetivos. De hecho, en la conferencia de septiembre del año 2010 en Nueva York, ya se trató de alguna manera identificar a la cultura como un factor a tener en cuenta de alguna u otra manera detrás de la consecución de los objetivos. Muchas gracias.
Do we have any more questions from the floor? Well, I mean, I would just like to throw in maybe one very quick one. Looking at the global transformations that much talked about, I just want to ask you whether you think the conditions would still exist 5-10 years down the line to come together and have this sort of you know, multilaterally agreed objective as the MDGs represent. If you listen to the voices coming from Asia, Korea, which is South Korea, which is even a member of the Development Assistance Committee, it seems to me that what a lot of these countries are saying in fundamental regard, you know, sort of pulls away from the traditional Western approach to doing development. So beyond the MDGs in 2015, do you think the condition would be there to embark on this sort of MDG adventure?
Yes, culture is very much at the core of this idea of adapting the goals to the local context. And that has been underplayed. And that's something, when I look back, this is perhaps the greatest regret I have. Because for me, it was so evident that we didn't have to underline it, that these were collective global targets, that it didn't mean that there were a straitjacket to be achieved by all countries in the same way. This is ludicrous, of course, for all of a sudden to assume that the rate of progress in those areas is going to be harmonized by a magic wand, which we call the MDGs. which was, of course, but this is what it has become because that's a result of this technocratic, excessively technocratic approach. And as you very much mentioned, this has to be tailored to the local context. Indigenous people, nomadic people, the whole gender problematic has to be taken on in a very subtle and acceptable way in all societies. We all have gone through our own processes. Again, if we were to look at the past 100 years of how Belgium and Spain have developed, very different trajectories, very different approaches. And yet today we are at the same level. We're mirror images. All these indicators are basically the same. But the way of getting there was defined by the local context. And that's why there are no techno-fixes to what are essentially political and cultural issues. And let that space be there. But what do we hear in the international community? We hear the adage very often expressed by donors of, we know what works. Right? We hear that time and again. There are even reports written on that. What will it take to reach the MDGs? And this is arrogant, because by doing that, you abstract away all the subtle differences that stem from historic context, from a cultural context, from religious dimensions that we cannot abstract away. That's very harmful. What is going on now is that several actors in the North, among the donor players, are trying to get control over the process of how to define the next shape of the MDGs. There are several of them. If I may be frank, and I only speak for myself now, I'm a free man. The most strategically placed and active partner is DFID. DFID is very active in already organizing a process, and they already have a very fine view of what the ultimate outcome should be. But they are not the only ones. There are very many actors in the North. In the South, Ola, it is not yet living. There is no hostility among the governments in the South about the MDGs. They value it for its purpose, but there is no momentum yet observable among key players in the South to join that debate and possibly to take control over that process. And that's worrisome, because I don't believe that the South will object to a new shape of the MDGs. It's almost self-evident. As we saw in the statistics, the majority of people say, yeah, it's good to have something like that. But of course, it depends on how it looks like. And my fear is that it's going to be another exercise in donorship. And it is high time to de-aid the whole MDG debate. We have dollarized the poverty debate, and we have donorized the MDG discourse. It is time now for us to take a step back and to let the South lead that process. It doesn't mean that we stay out of the debate. No, we are very much in it, but we cease to dominate it. We let it originate from the South. And if we use a good team like this, a peer and partner team, a peer is from the South and then the partners is a few from the North, maybe something very different, something very innovative will come. Because I'm the first one to say that what we have today needs to be improved. It was good the first time around, like MDG 8 was there, and it's very fuzzy, MDG 8. There's no actually numerical target, but symbolically it did the trick in the year 2000 to get the developing countries on our side. That is why the OECD targets didn't go anywhere, because they were purely for the developing countries and there was nothing in it for the rich countries. And the G77, as they are called in the UN, they said they were allergic to the international development goals of the OECD. It's by putting at the 8 that symbolically it was okay. But this time around, we are not going to get away with a fuzzy target like we have now. a bit of aid and a bit of trade and a bit of good governance. And no, it's not going to work. They will say, we want very concrete, quantifiable, trackable, traceable, monitorable targets on what you're going to do. So it is a long way ahead of it. There's a long, major political issues in it. But I still believe that in the end, something will come out. Definitely it will continue to exist, and I hope, that's my greatest hope, Ola, that it's not going to be the product of another donor-centric exercise. Thank you.
Seeing that all the questions have been exhausted, as it were, I'm only left with words of thanks to Jan for a very stimulating lecture and the questions and answers that have followed. In the name of all the collaborating organizations that have come together to make this event a reality, FRIDE, Fundación para las Relaciones Internacionales y el Diálogo Exterior, la Universidad CEU San Pablo, the European Commission, La Campania Millennium, whose representative is also here, would like to acknowledge you. I want to thank everybody for coming. It's exactly 9 o'clock. I think it's a perfect time to stop now. Once again, thank you all very much for coming. I wish you a safe trip back home.